Fun never ends, addendum time. Ever since I opened up the Discord, the lore of RWBY Alternate has just exploded. We have arcs, we have weapons, we have currencies, we have a timeline, we have fucking Dust Boys, and also maybe a sea bunny? Yeah, that. I didn't know either. So get out the fucking popcorn, my mostly dudes, cause it's gonna be a long-ass addendum. If you haven't seen the first two videos on RWBY Alternate, go watch them first because it gives a lot of the context, and also consider checking out my other content on this channel and Genesis Films. Discord link is in the description. First up, let's talk about Blake, cause it's a point brought up in the comments and in the Discord quite a bit. You all know that bullshit about Blake's parents not knowing she's a faunus? Yeah, out the window, fuck that. It's way too much trouble justifying something so minor a detail, so fuck it. They know she's a faunus, she knows they know, it's all out in the open. They're good parents and they want Blake to know they accept her for who and what she is, which, as an ideology she grew up with, could put her at odds with the extremist ideologies of the faunus organizations like the Faunus Liberation Army. That whole prosthetic business could still apply when she's hiding her status at Beacon. I still want her to exhibit toxic loneliness and all that stuff, but yeah, that whole not knowing angle is gone. It's stupid. Jerry made a big no-no. With that out of the way, let's move on to our standardized format for future addendums. Histories will contain geography, timelines, Grimm, Dust, the Empire, the Frontier, etc. Societies will have religion, culture, hunter societies, education, transportation, and economies. And characters will have story, development, arcs, interactions, OCs, and reworks. This way I'll be able to tackle the various ideas and notes I've added on since then. Please note, like everything else, these are not permanent changes to the canon. They can be contested, but also note they are decisions I've gone with, so keep that in mind when you're challenging them. The fall of the Empire is left vague. Based on this map, you can see the extent of it across the supercontinent of Terria. You can also see Marathon in the top right and a few enclaves of the Grafe to the west. More on them later. That circle in the middle of the old borders is, or was, considered the capital province of the Empire, Atlas. Over time it has evolved into the Kingdom of Atlas, a shadow of its former self. Despite being relatively stable, not many records are left from those days, and so the nature of the fall remains unknown. Dust comes from the moon, hence why religious scholars believe the moon is sacred, known as Ani, which is the imperial word for deity, or deity. Is that a cultural thing? Whatever. Although the use of dust as a power source originates from the Empire, it is believed that during the fall when the Empire collapsed and the moon split into fragments, certain shards of it fell to the earth all across Terria. Scholars believe from this hypothesis that this is why there is so much dust in Terria. It still doesn't explain how the Empire used dust, however. Although we could say that dust deposits, according to this hypothesis, were made from meteorites and ejecta that fall from the moon to the earth. Because I'm pretty sure that happens, right? In real life? When Ani, the moon, was wounded, the Empire called a state of emergency. This is when RWBY's calendar starts, year 0. From there, all military personnel and nobility were transported to the heart of the Empire, the mouth of the Seiros River, in the plains of Marathon. The territories were left to fend for themselves, and over a few generations the Empire had already been forgotten. However, civilization still thrived in Atlas. Grimm had crossed the Boro Mountains and the southern desert, and all of Marathon was at their mercy. It was Atlas that first introduced the hunters to Remnant. Through selective breeding and harsh training, they engineered a warrior class to fend off the demons from their lands. The defense was long, deadly, and difficult, and by the time hunters were clearing out Grimm outside Atlas's borders, the civilians they were saving had no recollection or obligation to the old Empire whatsoever, and because of the Empire's decentralized form of territorial acquisition, they didn't even speak the same language or share the same culture. For 500 years, more than 13 generations, Atlas was alone. They could barely conquer any of the surrounding land. The Grimm were restless, and the natives were impossible to subjugate. There was no way they were going to give these treacherous barbarians the technologies of their forefathers. Slowly but surely, the imperial way of life was forgotten, and Atlas's society evolved more and more into a form of government more suited for its isolationist hegemonic way of life. In 492 AE, or after Empire, the peace of the Emperor was abolished, and Atlas became a de facto kingdom, although keeping the title Imperator for its royalty. For the next millennia, Atlas retained control over the region by controlling the flow of the Seiros River. Havel, the Great Dam, was constructed circa 200 AE as a means of finding alternative power sources to dust. They realized that by restricting the flow of water and thereby the flow of goods, they could essentially bargain with other tribes into becoming tributaries, a la give us your money or you're not getting your Dakimakura. No, please! These tribes would essentially form into the Free Banks under Atlas's protection, and sea folk from the nearby islands would settle in this region for the same kind of tributary power. Their dependency on Atlas is felt even today. Side note, I'm not 100% sure how Atlas would restrict the flow of water, maybe channel it into aqueducts when they cut it off from the region, I don't know. For 1500 years, Atlas has narrowly avoided bankruptcy and collapse, but after a botched invasion of the Boro Principalities, mostly due to incompetent leadership, time has finally caught up to them. In a world of paper money, Atlas's hard currency, the Paris, crashed, and now the kingdom is in a state of severe social unrest. This will set the stage for the rise of the Kurisaim Party and the beginning of a new Atlan Empire. Oh, and the plural is Atlan, or Imperial, not Atlesian. Fucking Rooster Teeth, man. You have the shittiest world building. Just put an Ian after it. They're fucking idiots. Every other nation in Marathon, including Baradina-san, formed out of these tribes and villages over time. Some of them are still around if you haven't noticed. Boro is basically just a bunch of towns that everyone forgot about. Here's an outline I drew up from Marathon's history. It's not perfect, and some details are definitely left out, but it does give a good sense of time and scale. Feedback is appreciated. Moving on to the Grimm, circa 600 AE, Atlas's hunters as well as a few village militias finally pushed back the Grimm out of Marathon. And then after that, nothing. Anicism was really taking off, and a large part of its doctrine said that the Grimm were basically the children of Ani, and that humankind was banished to this one enclave of Teria. There were countless debates on whether or not the hunters should even push the Grimm out of Marathon, but with or without religion, the roads needed to be safe, and merchants didn't want the Grimm endangering the country's economies. Like, what's more important, repenting to a dead god or not starving? So it wasn't until rogue scholars and Solara-san started propagating that the Grimm were the reason the empire fell and that humankind was Ani's children all along, that a new belief started taking off, also known as Avanism. This conflicted pretty bad with Ani-cist countries, especially Atlas, which is ironic seeing as how they were the reason hunters even existed. The rest is history! People in the comments and in the Discord were pretty excited to come up with new, creepy designs for the Grimm, and started even making categories and types that one can find in the wild, and I'm just gonna say this. You see a Beowulf for the first time, it's pretty scary. You see it a second time, you know what to expect. In RWBY Alternate, not one Grimm is alike another. They are each a terrifying manifestation, independent of one another, and despite over a millennium of research, not one scientist, scholar or priest, has ever been able to create sufficient categories beyond ones that measure threat level. Here's that system one more time. In addition, there are extremely rare Grimm that measure beyond a Dark 4, but they're so rare no one bothers putting them in a category. And even bigger than that, we have 2 Primordial Grimm that only a handful of people have ever seen throughout history. The accounts vary, but what seems consistent with every case is that there are indeed 2. Take a wild guess what they called them. Congratulations, you got a genetically modified organic cookie, because that's the only goddamn way Atlas is feeding anyone in the fucking Arctic! That's not to say I'm dismissing the design ideas presented thus far. They can all apply to a Grimm, but they can't be that similar. I also mentioned that Grimm love being in dark places. So much so, in fact, that Grimm left in darkness usually grow and age faster, with the rarest Grimm even developing strange traits. Additionally, at night, Grimm receive a buff to their abilities since night is pretty much just a shadow in and of itself. They also have a strange connection to elemental dust. When Grimm chew dust, they gain that elemental ability. If they swallow it, it's refined in their belly over time, and becomes part of the loot that hunters get when they kill them. This makes them extremely valuable to kill in the frontier. Grimm find dust tasty, and have a minor dust sense with varying effectiveness with each Grimm, so dust deposits almost always have Grimm around them. This also attracts Grimm to the edge of the frontier, making finding near unending at the walls. As the Grimm decomposes, it produces whatever dust it consumed. If it chewed elemental dust in its lifetime, it produces dust of that type. Otherwise, the product is completely random. So, let's talk about the technicalities of dust. Out of all the topics brought up in the Discord, this is the one we hated talking about the most. Other than fucking cars, there are basically 6 types of dust: Infernus, Hydrus, Gelus, Cyclus, Terras, and Kinetas. Yeah, I don't know either. Each has their own strengths and weaknesses and work more efficiently under different conditions. However, they each produce the same effect. Upon igniting, they create a burst of energy that can be harnessed using conductors and Imperial Emeralds. Apparently, electricity is just the magnetic force of electrons pushing on each other from one atom to the next. So, just imagine that, but somehow as a product of combustion. I don't fucking know. I ain't no goddamn schooler. The process of combining them to form artificial compounds is still shaky at best, so I won't go into that quite yet. Just know that the fusion process starts with grinding down 2 types of dust into powder alongside a clear dust compound that's extremely rare, then putting the powder into a water or chemical solution, which starts the crystallization process. The time it takes for the dust to crystallize takes months in a process similar to creating fine wine. This method is relatively recent and functions in competition with the emergence of internal combustion engines and steam power, and is also generally kept under wraps by Atlan scientists. The last thing I want to talk about in this category has absolutely nothing to do with RWBY Former and is a completely original idea. That's not sarcasm, this really is a cool idea. Far out west, beyond the knowledge of any man, woman, or child in Remnant, are the Graef, a tribal race of humanoids composed partially of precious metals, minerals, and dust. The word Graef comes from the imperial word for dust, a language which has since prospered in the west, failing to succumb to the years of societal evolution as seen in Marathon. Being composed primarily of the essence of Ani, the Graef can use dust in its most primitive form to control the elements and fend off the Grimm. Their way of life has remained relatively the same for thousands of years. They don't have hearts. They have a large clear dust crystal instead. They also have a smaller stomach and intestinal tract, so they don't eat as much. When they channel dust, their eyes, the root of their hair, the tips of their teeth, their claws, and the crystallized dust in their heart turns the color of the dust they are channeling. Wait, claws? To combat the Grimm, every Graef is trained from birth to master the properties of primitive dust, even learning how to regenerate using it. Thusly, the Graef have evolved into a warrior cult not unlike the Spartans of ancient Greece, with their own sense of duty, honor, and glory to their families and their clan. Not much is known about the Graef. Those that venture east to Marathon do so in small covert groups, and keep a careful watch of the hunters in the nations of Marathon. We call them Dust Boys. The colloquial in-world insult is Dust Punks. With the rise of industry in Marathon and the absence of religious doctrine in everyday life, there are a small few clinging to the good Avanist way of life that seems to be crumbling away. A sort of religious awakening, if you will, where powerful figures attempt to reintegrate religion into an ever-modern world, to little success. The Church of Beacon is one such example. There are tons of sects of Avanism, but not many of Anicism. Gayatri is obviously a sect of Avanism, but is notably more extremist than others. This kind of ties into Beacon because they use it in practice, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The Gayatri believe that hunters are subject to a 3-tiered system of semblance that has roots in the early days of post-imperial Atlas. Here's how the tiers go. Tier 1 is known as breaking the shell, and it typically requires the hunter to undergo a significant amount of physical trauma or stress. The ideal result of this process, however the church institutes it, is an enhancement of the hunter's physical abilities, including but not limited to regeneration. There is a slim chance the hunter will only break their body in the process and not achieve a Tier 1 awakening. Despite being a requirement to become a hunter at Beacon, survival rates are 80%. Tier 2 is called freeing the mind, and hunters typically achieve this tier by undergoing an extreme amount of mental stress or trauma. It's not required by the Church of Beacon to go through this process, but if the applicant agrees to it, the church will begin to investigate the self via interviews and tests to better determine what is required to free the mind, so to speak. Although hunters who achieve Tier 2 awakening can expect faster reflexes and better judgment, they also run the risk of losing their mind or even going brain dead. Survival rates are half and half at 50%. Tier 3 is the rarest and most dangerous tier to achieve of all. Becoming the Self is a direct test of one's aura, and is only ever attempted by older hunters who have long since graduated Beacon. The survival rate is 20%, and only a handful of hunters today have successfully passed it. Those that do not only become the most powerful a hunter can be, but they also receive the mythical Silver Eyes, which become so ingrained in a person's aura that they are passed down to their descendants. The circumstances of this test vary with each person, but the general idea is the same. In this respect, this is where I want to reintegrate semblance as an extension of the aura. I don't know how or why it works, but it's tied to religious doctrine, so it goes here, I guess. This is where Silver Eyes comes from. When Atlas was pressed to defend their borders, they drilled civilians into becoming Tier 3 hunters, although the terminology was certainly different at the time. Thousands of abducted peasants, their loved ones tricked under the guise that Grimm were taking their children in the night, were conditioned to become inhuman warriors capable of fighting back the creature's en masse. The survival rates were not encouraging. Silver Eyes themselves don't grant any special powers, but they are indicative of a long line of hunters, or at least an ancestor who achieved Tier 3 awakening. It does disappear over time though. This is why Ruby has the eyes. Despite not being fervent followers of the Gayatri belief, her mother and grandmother achieved Tier 3, so everyone expects her to do the same. No student has ever tried becoming the self while at Beacon. To their instructors and their parents, it might as well be suicide. So it's not like they want her to achieve Tier 3 now or anything, but they do have high expectations. I'm not sure Silver Eyes make it easier to achieve Tier 3 yet, so I'll leave that in the air. As another side note, Tier 3's effect is left intentionally vague. It's a measure of the aura or soul, so whatever effect it has is typically what that person wants most. Okay, let's move on. The pseudo-communist state of Mistral isn't really an active player, it's more so neutral. It's got a Hong Kong-like island owned by the Free Banks somewhere on its eastern shore. Don't ask me where, they're just making this shit up for me. Plural is Mistran. It's on mostly neutral relations with everyone, save Atlas, who they're in constant competition with as the leading manufacturing economy behind the Free Banks. Torrent's government is ruled by a chancellor, the plural being Torian. They're on good relations with Guileless as sort of a friendly rival and depend quite a bit on the refined goods of the Free Banks. As a side note, everyone is in good standing with the Free Banks, except maybe the Free Banks itself.
Ironic.
They're on bad relations with Atlas and, of course, the Principalities. However, Torrent will, in the immediate future, make a pact with Atlas to partition up the divided West. Sort of like, hey, fuck your shitty empire, but fuck these little bitches too. So for all intents and purposes, this is Poland now. I thought I'd sneak in some Polish music. Hope you enjoyed. Guileless is in good relations with Torrent, the Free Banks, and strangely enough, Baradina-san. Guileless is the only country left that has its Gaitric Church as an integral part of the state, although it's not particularly powerful. And even though it's an offshoot of Avanism, the Anarchist Emirates will take what it can in an ever-secular world. Because, come on, poor bastards all alone down there. Plural is Asar. The Free Banks goes without saying. It's patronized by Marathon and submissive to the will of Atlas. Whoever controls the banks controls all of Marathon, and with Atlas's influence waning, this will be the defining moment of Marathon's future. Or maybe they can just lobby the Free Banks Council of Interest to get what they want. No idea what the plural is. I guess it depends. Maybe Keren. Ooh, Keren. Celebrier's government is a federal republic. Only landowners can vote every 5 years for the next president. Their military is largely defensive and, with major powers at their borders, is ready for a fight anytime. When they're not at war, these soldiers are backed by the government to become mercenaries for other countries. The profit goes to the soldier, with a small percent going to the government. As such, there are lots of career soldiers in Celebrier. Unique to Celebrier also is its two capitals, a peacetime capital and a wartime capital. One is a center of culture, commerce, and political power, and the other is a base built on an imperial military installation, perhaps the most well-defended and powerful piece of land in all of Teria. Because the land is pretty arable and their neighbor Mistral lacks the natural resources to find their own dust, miners buy their food from foreign merchants in exchange for dust and minerals. As such, Celebrier and Mistral are on fairly good terms. Plural is Kelish. The Principalities are a loose confederation of states that populate the Bora Mountains. They're only in a confederation to freely trade with each other, but that doesn't stop each of them from declaring war on one another. Plural is Bourbon, totally at the mercy of Atlas and Torrent. Because they're relatively poor, no one wants to be their ally. Even the Free Banks are like, yeah, no? Let's finish off with Atlas. Their government is an electoral monarchy in which the office is elected via a system of nobles to a member of a royal family. They hate everyone, and the feeling is mutual. They hoard resources and information, and have been at war on and off with the surrounding city-states for over a millennium. Someone made a comparison to the Institute from Fallout 4, and yeah, that's about right. They're entitled aristocrats that live off the working class and tax the Free Banks like crazy because they control the opening to Seiros. They hold them on a leash. Due to economic straits, the Kurdistan Party, the anti-Faunus faction, is on the rise in popularity, and like I said before, plural is Atlan. This is a bit of a tangent, but it does involve Atlas. So there are antidepressants like alcohol, booze, and all that, but there are also drugs augmented with elemental dust. Okay, wait, hear me out. It's outlawed pretty much everywhere because the results are oftentimes explosive, but in Atlas it was made legal by its fucking stupid, incompetent, fat-ass king in a desperate bid to fix its economy. The result is a lot of poor peasants exploding. The result is a lot of poor peasants exploding in ghettos and alleyways. And it's just a massive drug epidemic where they're all just exploding. It puts a lot of pressure on the working class to rise up, so to speak, and remove the ruling class. And also the fondness, I guess. Just fuck everyone. Just fuck them all. Moving on to transportation. For obvious reasons, horses are the main transport on the frontier and in the countrysides. For example, not many cars in Hensmere, but lots of horses. Horses are indigenous to the plains of Marathon and can sometimes be found south in Seiros. Carriages are also used commonly in the country, but also in cities. In fact, it's the main mode of transportation there by the beginning of the story. You also got bicycles. I mentioned briefly in the beginning of the original RWBY alternate video that some technologies like airships were reverse engineered by Atlas to function after the Empire's fall, and while that is the case, there are only a few airships left, a handful to be precise. Almost all of them belong to Atlas and are used for luxury cruises, but the Freebanks actually owns one themselves, using it for the transportation of goods. Guess where they bought it from? But by far the most common and native mode of transportation for long distances is the steam locomotive. Introduced by Celebrier as an alternative to Atlas's pesky dust, the locomotive is extremely useful for cargo, domestic, and international travel. Every major nation in Marathon, including Baradinasan, has hub stations set up for incoming and departing services both at home and abroad. When Celebrier was the first to use trains to move across mountains, Atlas then copied this idea and established the first international railway to the Free Banks. You got some alternatives to Dust? Boom. Turn it on its head. Here's an international railway. But that makes no sense at all. It's passing through like 5 countries. You can't just do that. I'm Atlas. I can do whatever the fuck I want! So naturally, things are pretty fucking tense. I'm reluctant to say there are cars yet. On one hand, they are anti-fantasy and sort of encompass everything Tolkien's work stands against. Industry, mechanical power, the assembly line, all that stuff. And on the other hand, it's kind of what you would expect to come out of this world. I mean, we're talking about the Industrial Revolution. There's gotta be something there. So in keeping with Tolkien's diminishing of the world theme, let's just say that cars start getting really public in the endgame. I don't know when, why, or how, but by the hypothetical last episode, cars are a common man's mode of transportation. But in the beginning? No, absolutely not. This is a story of fantasy desperately trying to stave off the advances of a mechanical humankind. I'm not gonna start the battle after the war is already over, Andrew. This script is getting long, so I'm just gonna wrap this section up with some Hunter Society stuff. Beacon was originally started by a group of 4 hunters known as Summer Rose, Crow Branwen, Raven Branwen, and Taiyang Xiaolong. When Fire Team Stark fell apart after the death of Summer Rose and the disappearance of Raven Branwen, Crow and Taiyang ultimately screwed themselves out of the ownership and sold the campus to a private investor from Atlas, Sir Jacques Schnee. Him and his family have since turned the school into a church and taken up residence in its halls, but not without upholding the legacy of its silver-eyed founder, Summer Rose. Fire teams in academies exist mainly for protection. While experienced hunters should have no problem facing the average Dark 2, initiates and acolytes might not be so lucky. So, hunter societies tend to pair students up in groups of 4. Some of these teams bond so well that they stay together well into their adult years, like Stark. Most, however, just split after graduation. The composition of the team is entirely up to the academy, and in the case of RWBY, they thought 2 complete strangers to combat training would fare well with another 2 that not only have gone through combat training, but are also siblings and the daughters of the founder, Summer Rose. Also, the naming is purely for convenience sake. Originally, RWBY was called Wibber as per the instruction of Jacques Schnee, but Weiss had it changed as to not make herself the center of attention. Also, there's Beacon on the map, right there, right in between this little valley right here is the mountains. You get there via train. It's cool. I don't know where the train is, but you get there from train. I am the King of England. No, sir. I was supposed to talk about militaries, but I'm past the point of no return. Here's some brief summaries. Jesus Christ, I'm gonna die. People in the Discord really wanted to put their OCs in. I'm only going to confirm one of them so far. maybe 2. I'll consider the others in the next addendums, but just know that if they're part of the story, they are very inconsequential and don't have that much an impact. Side characters reintroduced from RWBY Former have greater priority. I won't go into details. If you want them, check out our Discord for the character sheets, but the 3 characters I'm letting in for now are Nasida or Lewis, a dust boy who was banished from the West, Ebony Snow, a vengeful faunus that gives Blake reason to avoid getting caught, and Tom Lawrence, my personal favorite, who is another spy sent from Baradin-Hassan, sent to check up on Nora and Lee Ren, so to speak. Without further ado, let's do our main characters, with wonderful concept art by Soon Playing. Yay! Not really, thank you so much. RWBY is a 16-year-old girl with aspirations to become a great hunter like her mother, Summer Rose. Having inherited her mother's silver eyes, everyone, including her father Tai Yang, has very high expectations for her. After Summer's death, Tai Yang began coddling RWBY, giving her special training and treatment. Despite his hardest attempts, she is still very childish and naive, and at the age of 16, she still wears onesies and religiously ingests sweets. And yet, even after her maturity eventually kicks in, she still wants to be as great a hunter as Summer Rose, even if it means breaking her body, mind, and soul. At the start of the series, she is yet to unlock Tier 1 semblance, but is instructed to equip a halberd and a standard bolt-action rifle common among Gaelic infantrymen. When she reaches Tier 1 and eventually Tier 2, she will start equipping a dust-augmented scythe in addition to a rifle. In this sense, we will see her earn Crescent Rose as opposed to her already having it. Someone in the Discord noted that Crescent Rose relies entirely on RWBY's semblance of speed, so it's absolutely fair to introduce it later. You also kind of require speed for a scythe to work as a weapon, so yeah. While Tier 1 is universally a buff to physical strength, Tier 2 and 3 will vary with each hunter. RWBY's Tier 2 is an additional boost to her speed, and Tier 3, as the Discord predicts, will be something analogous to teleportation. So Tier 3 will be when you start seeing that rose petal shit. As some students are allowed to do, Yang chose not to enlist in a fire team for her second year at Beacon, deciding to train alone rather than alongside her peers. More than anything else, she desires for her father, a man she hates, to admire her as the prodigal daughter, in hopes that by outcompeting RWBY, she can prove herself as the superior sibling. Ironically, she's something of a problem child as well, always sneaking out, drinking or with boys, slightly promiscuous, but definitely not a slut. She's kind of a bully too. Anytime RWBY is praised for things that are either minor or inherent to her character, like the silver eyes, Yang goes on a bitch fit. But RWBY only takes that as her goading her to be even better, so things just escalate until that terrible, terrible fight, which is a direct result of RWBY being made the fire team leader, despite Yang's age and experience. At series start, 17-year-old Yang has already unlocked Tier 1 semblance and is already pulling bigger and harder punches than anything her sister can achieve. There's still some contention on whether or not she's still going to be using shotgun gauntlets, considering we want to make this within the realm of realism and she'll just end up shooting her arms, so I won't comment any further on the matter. Tier 2 Yang is when she has access to an ability called Rage, where she takes whatever damage is inflicted onto her and gives it back twofold. Get it? And her Tier 3 ability is just straight up deflecting the damage right back at the assailant. As I've mentioned previously, Blake comes from a family denied by their homeland and is becoming a hunter so they can get majority citizenship. It's a pretty complex scenario, but long story short, she's doing this for her family, and the fear that she'll be discovered as a faunus is exacerbated by the fact that Beacon is so anti-faunus. Her toxic loneliness perpetuates a state of constant distrust, solidarity, and scrutiny. She hates big crowds and keeps to herself quite often. Just note that her loner personality is older than her faunus traits, and not a result of them. She's also the same age as RWBY. She finds using a pair of hidden blades to be best suited for her, choosing to fight from the shadows rather than get messy. Slowly, over the course of her education, Blake develops an assassin-based fighting style, wielding kunai, hidden blades, and throwing knives to silently eliminate the enemy. Yes, this is effective on Grimm. And also, yes, this is literally just Assassin's Creed now. She even comes from a city-state! Blake's Tier 2 ability is After Image, which is pretty much just what she can already do in RWBY Former, but her Tier 3 power is summoning a clone made of dust to distract or fight alongside with. Obviously, she needs some kind of dust to summon it, and depending on the type of dust, it can do certain things. Part of the last week in the RWBY Alternate Discord has been an exploration into how much people don't care about Weiss. Even now, we barely have anything more than we already started with. We've got a really nice design from Soon Plank and some tier and weapon stuff, but god damn you guys. She's just a Disney princess. I mean, there's gotta be some stuff we can do. Anyways, 17-year-old Weiss wields a rapier as usual, but as she continues her education, she eventually ditches the sword altogether and goes for a bow that also functions as dual blades. It's symbolism! Her Tier 2 semblance allows her to use glyphs to alternate her fighting styles, which isn't that different from the show either, and Tier 3 gives her the ability to summon creatures made out of dust to fight alongside with. Wait, what the fuck? This is just Blake. Cypher, you bitch! You just wrote Blake twice! But, Yeah, we need help with Weiss. Side characters. Juniper is basically the same. I can imagine Pyra and Weiss bonding fairly well over the expectations their fathers have placed on them, but also feeling the need to antagonize one another as their public ideologies are contending for the fate of Atlas. My dad is such a pain. Your dad sucks too? Dad's a real hard ass sometimes. I don't have a dad. As you can imagine, these expectations bring Ruby and Juniper together pretty well. That, and I am extremely lazy at character writing. Anyways, moving on. Tai Yang was among the 4 hunters that started the Church of Beacon, and unbeknownst to Ruby or Yang, deliberately sabotaged its ownership rights after Summer Rose passed away, choosing to hand the reins to a private investor rather than Crow, which is why Crow keeps his distance. He's since settled down in Hensmere to raise Ruby and Yang, lamenting his failed marriages and just generally being a very insecure man. He leans on Ruby something awful, and justifies his distance with Yang as sort of an analog for Raven. And it's not like he's afraid Yang won't succeed. If Ruby doesn't succeed, which she is expected to given her heritage, he believes he will have failed Summer. If Yang is in trouble, he knows she'll get back on her feet. But if Ruby is in trouble, that's the end of the goddamn world. The girl is still wearing onesies! Tai Yang's second wife and the mother of Ruby Rose, Summer was the oldest, most experienced, and highest-ranking hunter in Fireteam Stark. Achieving Tier 3 Awakening at a relatively young age, she was well known as a superb fighter and a charismatic, noble leader. To many, including her children, she was an idol, symbolizing everything that hunters stood for. And then suddenly, one day, she passed away. It's unknown whether she fell prey to a grim miasma or an unknown disease, but nevertheless, she left her family just 6 years after Ruby was born. Ever since then, her legacy, the Egalitarian Academy of Beacon, has been transformed into a Gaitric church and ideologically dismantled. She serves as an idol and an ultimate goal for Ruby's character. Crow is being kept the exact same as he is in Ruby Former. After losing the ownership rights to Beacon and essentially getting ousted by Tai Yang, Crow became a mercenary and started drinking heavily. He occasionally visits his nieces, but not enough to be a major influence. At least that's what Tai Yang wants. Instead, Ruby just ends up fawning over Summer Crow and her grandmother's style of fighting, using dust-infused scythes and semblance speed. He's quiet and laid back, he doesn't like involving himself, and in the spirit of his sister, tends to avoid altercations more often than fight. Raven is Crow's sister and the least talkative of the group. Like her brother, much of Raven's past is shrouded in mystery. Her years of fighting Grimm has left her, ironically, dehumanized and sullen to the point of lacking any and all affection. She thought marrying Tai Yang would fix all that, but when Yang was born, she realized she was not prepared for the responsibilities of parenthood. She did not want her daughter following in her footsteps, so she left, and disappeared without a trace. When the time came for Yang to seek out her mother after a devastating fight with Ruby, Raven is reluctant to be the role model her daughter is looking for, lamenting her lack of humanity and long-term commitment. Penny is General Ironwood's daughter. Before she enlisted at Beacon, her and her mother were sent away from Atlas to Torinth for fear of the social unrest in Atlas going sour. She knows random historical facts and loves to go on rants about how a perceived historical event was more than what people give it for. Basically Yukari. She's very much out of touch with culture and seems much more like a 30-year-old dad in a 17-year-old teenager's body. Oh, and also she's not an android. Maria, or the Grim Reaper, is Summer Rose's mother and Ruby's grandmother. She was the first in the family to achieve Tier 3 Awakening, and did so at a remarkably fast pace, although she's very secretive about it and likes to talk to her children in riddles. After Summer passed away, Maria became the voice of reason in their Hensmere household, becoming something of a matriarch. Now she's the closest thing Ruby has to her mother, and Maria feels obligated to fill that hole in her heart. Torchwick is the suave and charming crime boss of the week, and will do anything for a dishonest buck. He's particular, intimidating, not prone to violence, quirky, and loves using his walking stick in fights that have no place for it. Strangely enough, he is very anal about food. Perhaps he was a chef for a time and the quirks of the restaurant business stayed with him. I don't know, some kind of weird and fun backstory to make him dynamic. Other than that, he's completely the same as Ruby Former, a rogue at its finest. Conversely, Neo is the exact same as well. She's no longer fully psycho, however, and spends a lot more time in the field than Torchwick. She's the Shigo to Dr. Draken, just not as level-headed or as talkative. She's a secretary by day and a prized agent by night. She somehow manages to get more shit done than Torchwick himself, and yet tags along with him every time. As for a backstory, go nuts, people. Ozpin is a teacher at Beacon, and being tenured, is the only professor that is openly critical of the church's practices. He's the unorthodox professor, with wild arguments and tangents that seem relatively detached from standard classroom etiquette. It's hinted that he knows a little more than he's letting on, but by no means is he some stupid god or whatever. He's just the fun teacher with snarky and fourth wall breaking jabs. Pretty much just Excalibur. Ironwood, Penny's father, is a decorated Outland general who has led the country to many victories over the years. During the invasion of Boro, the king ordered him to to besiege a particularly impossible city, and Ironwood, being the wiser, refused for the sake of his men. He was removed from command, and the war ended in a white peace. Now with the country up in arms, he only wants him and his family to be safe, so he sends them to Torinth in the meantime. Eventually, the time will come for him to abandon his post and join the Torian military in hopes of protecting his family. Adam is complicated. Without giving too much away, he's the figurehead of the White Fang, an underground movement to smuggle Faunus out of Atlas. Atlan civilians are led to believe he's a terrorist leader given the actions of the FLA, the Faunus Liberation Army, but in actuality he's a genuinely good person acting on behalf of his people. Think John Connor, but much more passionate, a little too prideful, and somewhat quirky. If Beacon never existed, he would absolutely be the main protagonist. And Winter, Weiss's older sister, is the queen consort of Atlas and the wife of the current king, Louis of the Capetus dynasty. She's extremely capable and looking for a way to oust her husband and become the new queen of Atlas. By whatever means necessary, she seeks to restore order and seize the throne. Whether things go as planned will be up to the Discord in due time, but for now, she is acting on behalf of the Schnee family and wants nothing more than the imperial throne. Everyone else I do want to confirm feels either inconsequential or lacks a role in the story, so I won't bother saying them until we have them fleshed out. Again, RWBY is the protagonist. These guys are just for spicing up her struggle towards being the best hunter. If I feel as though they're taking up too much of the show, they will be cut back. As a final note, because this video is way too long for an addendum and I need to write a fucking essay on the emergence of complex storytelling in video games, the final goal of this community project is to have a fully complete, fully fleshed out, final story bible with thorough descriptions of RWBY Alternate's history, societies, and characters. We're not trying to make money off this. We don't have a Patreon and we don't take donations. We take concept art, fanfiction, and referrals via word of mouth. We want this story to get out there, an open book for anyone willing to contribute. We've already had some tremendous people help us already, and I just want to take a few moments to name them. A.R. Finch, Ariona, the 80,000's 42nd Anakin, Atelier, Azeloth, Blood Red AI, Chum Chum, Corte de Royale, Cricket, Define Darkness, Dark Phoenix, Donut, Draken, Ducky, Emo Anime Lover, Engineer Boy, Fairy Bun, Foxen, Keru Goblin, Golden Deus Ex Machina, JD Benner, John F. Geileman, Juggernaut, Jusho P, Kilokev, Lofty M, Lambda Delta, Lily Kari, Lunar Shadow 55, Mariner, Marshall, Mulman, Naked Brass, Nightwolf, One True Senpai, Origami 123, Pixel, Prime, Progidius, Psycho Jester, Red Arrow, Red Ginger Ale, Ron Dalserept, Ruby I Broke the Toaster, Runic, Safety Waffles, Scoot, Cypher, Sir Atlas, Soon Plunk, Soundless Plum, Spanky 117, TJ, That Millionth Man, That One Bard, The Cheekiest Breaky, The Only Outlast, Teal, Troll Bomber, Uncle Grandpa, and Volpez. Thank you guys so much for contributing to the lore so far. If I forgot to mention you, please DM me. I'll add you in a list in the comments. Thank you all for watching our community addendum, and I'll see you next time.
Oh my god, dude. So fucking dead.